Hello everyone, and welcome to a video that's a little bit out of the ordinary, but is one that I promised you on my 300 subscriber thank you video. Basically, in this video I'll be talking about my favourite movie scores of all time. And the reason I wanted to do this is, one, this is a video I've always wanted to do, and two, is a way of saying thank you for me reaching 300 subscribers. I feel like music nowadays is an area of movies that doesn't really get talked about as much as it should, because music really is an important part of filmmaking. If you're trying to convey a very specific tone or style or emotion, then 9 out of 10 times music is the very thing that can do that. Yes, sometimes the music can be a bit overbearing and can kind of force an emotion down your throat, but sometimes when the music is just right, it can convey a tone or a style or an emotion just the way it really should be, alongside things like cinematography and acting and all that. The music is usually the thing that kind of wraps the package in a nice bow and just adds to the movie as a whole. And coming from myself, I love music, not just film-related music, but I love music in general. It's probably my second biggest interest outside of movies. And yeah, I love lots of different bands. I have a very eclectic taste in music, or at least I like to think so anyway. And yeah, I was really looking forward to doing this video because music isn't something I get to talk about that often on this channel, mainly considering it's a movie-related channel anyway. So yeah, I am really going to enjoy talking about my 10 favourite movie scores, because I think you'll be surprised by some of my choices. Now, before I get into my list, I want to clarify a couple of things. There were a couple of rules that I stuck to when making this list. First of all, I can only use a certain composer once. And the main reason I'm sticking to that rule is because this list would otherwise just be filled up with Michael Giacchino and Hans Zimmer. So it'd be a bit unfair. So I'm sticking to one composer per soundtrack. Also, as you can probably tell, this list excludes soundtracks to movies. So things like the Guardians of the Galaxy soundtrack or the Pulp Fiction soundtrack. Music to a film that is like a collection of pre-existing songs, those don't count. This specifically has to be made for the movie in question. And the last thing I must say, which it goes without saying, but this is my personal opinion, so if one of my favourites doesn't agree with yours or vice versa, then, you know, tough shit, these are my personal favourites. Although, that being said, I would like to see in the comments what some of your favourite movie scores are in the comments down below. I'd be really interested. So, without any further ado, let's get into the list, and at number 10 is Jurassic Park by John Williams. I knew that there had to be some form of a John Williams score on this list. I mean, it would be kind of rude not to include him on this list, considering the legacy he's created over the years. I mean, the guy created the Star Wars soundtrack, for fuck's sake. That shit is iconic. But I will admit, choosing one of his scores to put on this list was very hard, and you'll notice that is a recurring theme throughout this video. Trying to choose my favourite score from a specific composer was very hard, because a lot of these composers have done such great work over the past, especially John Williams. But I think in the end I went for Jurassic Park because it sums up his style in a nutshell, and I do think it has the best impact out of a lot of his other scores. I was very close to choosing something like Saving Private Ryan or the original Star Wars or even Harry Potter, but I think Jurassic Park is that perfect blend of his whimsical side but also his tense, almost horrific side to music as well. The best way I can describe this soundtrack is like, there's elements of the whimsical side of his music from, say, the Superman soundtrack, mixed in with, like, the tense aspects of his Jaws soundtrack. Put those together and you kind of have the Jurassic Park soundtrack, because there are moments of pure wonder and whimsy, especially in, like, the main theme of the movie, which, as you know, is iconic and is absolutely beautiful, especially for the moments it's used in the movie, it works bloody brilliantly. But there are also elements of tension and pure suspense and horror where he manages to get pretty much the most he can out of the orchestra to really make it sound as tense as he can. And there are some moments specifically in the movie where the music really shines. I mean, there are some moments in the film where Spielberg just completely strips the score away and just has pure silence, which works just as well. But to be honest, the best moments in the movie are when John Williams' score comes to the forefront. Also, considering this is a movie about dinosaurs, John Williams also manages to make a few moments stand out where he manages to mix in these almost primal, tribal elements into the score, and I really do appreciate that, and it really does add to the mystery and eeriness of the whole thing, especially nearer the start of the film anyway, when you're not 100% sure what is going to happen. So moving on, at number 9 we have Inception by Hans Zimmer. Now, his score for Inception is one of those scores, a little bit like Jurassic Park, I guess, where people instantly recognise it, even if they haven't seen the movie or not. And that is probably due to the fact that this movie started the trend of the whole, overbearing French horn thing. Blah, blah, that whole thing. And yeah, even though it can be very overused nowadays, especially in some movie trailers, the fact that this was the first one to do it kind of seems a bit, I suppose the term is groundbreaking, considering that it started a trend. Whether you like it or not, that's up to you. But outside of the gimmicky French horns, this soundtrack is the definition of the word epic. What Hans Zimmer is able to craft in this, in the music for this film, perfectly encapsulates the frenetic moments you do get in the latter half of Inception. And there are some moments in the score that just instantly stick in your head, whether you've even seen the movie or not. For example, the first track in the score, which I think is called "The Dream Is Collapsing," that was stuck in my head for months after I watched the movie, and is still stuck in my head today. Like, even talking about it, I can think of it now in my head. It's such a well-crafted piece of music, and there's also some inclusions from Johnny Marr, who, if you don't know who Johnny Marr is, you really need to educate yourself. But Johnny Marr is basically the guitarist for the Smiths, who are one of the best bands of the 80s, in my opinion. And there are some moments in, again, the latter half of the soundtrack which utilise his guitar playing, and he really manages to get the most out of him as well. Even though there are times where his guitar playing is very subtle, it works to the best of its ability, in my opinion. Especially in the track which is called Time, which is the one that plays right at the end of the movie with that iconic shot of the the thing spinning on the table. That perfectly just sums up the feeling and the how you're supposed to feel in that moment. There is something therapeutic about that ending, but the way it ends kind of leaves you everything unanswered. And that's kind of how the end of the movie is, and the fact that the music is able to represent that is really impressive. At number 8 is The Red Turtle by, Laurent Perez Del Mar. I've probably butchered that name, but I don't care, because whoever they are, they made a fucking beautiful soundtrack that goes alongside this movie so well. If you haven't heard of The Red Turtle, it's basically this... It's classed as an anime, even though it was made in France, but I think it's mainly because it was distributed by Studio Ghibli. But yeah, it's a French-made animated movie with no dialogue in it at all, and all you really have are the sound design and the music to carry the movie forward, as well as the imagery as well. And the music is so gorgeous. It fits with the beautiful aesthetic of the movie, the simple and beautiful aesthetic, that is. And it's just really effective. There really isn't much I can say about this score, except for the fact that it perfectly fits the imagery to a T, and that it genuinely is just gorgeous to listen to on its own. If you haven't seen The Red Turtle, or if you haven't even heard the soundtrack, I highly recommend you do, because it is one of my favourites. I didn't think it would be one of my favourites, but the longer it has been since I've seen that movie, the more I keep coming back to that soundtrack, just because of how memorable and just brilliant it is. At number 7 is a score that a lot of you are probably surprised is this far back on the list, but nonetheless it's on the list anyway, and that's The Good, the Bad and the Ugly by Ennio Morricone. I mean, what can I really say about this score that hasn't been said already? It is legendary. Whether you're talking about the main theme of the movie, or whether you're talking about the iconic Ecstasies of Gold, which is just a brilliant track. And again, similar to Jurassic Park, if you'd never even seen the film, you would have heard the music somewhere. I mean, the music for this movie, and I will admit all of Ennio Morricone's scores for the spaghetti western films, perfectly sum up that entire genre. And for one piece of music to sum up an entire genre is just incredible, and is very rare nowadays. Usually, a lot of scores nowadays sound very similar, because a lot of the stuff that is iconic and is groundbreaking has already been done. So, for a piece of music, a singular piece of music, to summarize an entire genre is just incredibly impressive. I mean, as soon as you hear the theme for The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, you instantly think Western. You might not necessarily always think of The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, especially if you haven't seen the film, but as soon as you hear that opening, that opening tune, you instantly think of the spaghetti western genre. And that's just incredibly impressive. And even what he is able to do nowadays, especially with his score for The Hateful Eight, still has elements of his old spaghetti western scores, but is a lot dialed back. But I do think The Good, the Bad and the Ugly is him at his prime. Even though I do really like his score for A Few Dollars More, especially the chime part. That bit is just so iconic and just so good. But yeah, his score for The Good, the Bad and the Ugly is iconic for a reason, and is the reason it's made this list. At number 6 is Star Trek by Michael Giacchino. Now, for those of you that don't know, Michael Giacchino is my favourite composer ever. I've seen him in concert twice, both at the Royal Albert Hall, and I think he's made some of the best scores of recent years. Which is why I knew I had to have one of his scores on this list, without a doubt, but having to choose one was incredibly hard. Super 8 is a fantastic score that perfectly sums up that film in a nutshell. His score for Up, I mean, it won an Oscar for fuck's sake, so of course it's fucking good. But I think in the end I had to go for his score for Star Trek, because it's the first score of his that genuinely blew me away. Because it sums up the style and tone of the movie, as well as the frenetic pace of the film as well, while still making it feel like Star Trek. For a new generation, anyway. And his main theme for this Star Trek trilogy, anyway, is one that I constantly hum wherever I am, because it's one of those earworms that never leaves your head. But even though the theme for this movie is really, really good, the quieter moments on this soundtrack are also really good as well, especially Labour of Love, which plays right at the start of the movie during the little opening scene of the film, that piece really does pull at your heartstrings. And then accompanied alongside such an emotionally powerful opening scene really works wonders. I mean, I don't really know what else to say. Michael Giacchino is a genius. He's made some of my favourite scores of recent years. If this was a more generalised list and not just stuck to movies, then my favourite score of his is actually his score for Medal of Honor Frontline, which is a video game from, I think, 2002. His score for that is fucking incredible and is one of my favourites because every time I hear it, it just brings back so many childhood memories of playing that game on the PlayStation. So yeah, if this was a more generalised list, that would definitely be on here instead of Star Trek. But because it stuck to movies, I had to go with Star Trek just because of what he was able to accomplish, and the amount of the range of emotions he was able to pull off in this one score. Also, I love the soundtrack for this movie so much that it is the only movie score that I own on vinyl. There are loads that I've been wanting to get on vinyl, but this is the only one I've actually gone out of my way to get on vinyl. And it sounds bloody brilliant on this, like it does, you know, however you listen to it. At number 5 is Tron Legacy by Daft Punk. Now, say what you will about this movie, I'm aware that it has its haters and its lovers. I'm somewhere in the middle, because I've always had a soft spot for Tron Legacy, as I have very vivid memories of seeing it in the cinema. But that being said, I am aware of the faults of the film. The characters and the story are rather bland, so to speak, but the visuals and the music are so fucking good that I'm willing to an extent, overlook the faults of the movie. I'm aware it's not a perfect film, but the visuals and the music to this movie are just so damn good that I can't help but keep coming back to this film. I mean, I even bought it on Blu-ray the other week because I couldn't stop thinking about it. And that's saying something considering I hadn't seen it since 2011. But the best aspect of this movie, by far, is the soundtrack by Daft Punk. I've always liked Daft Punk as artists anyway, but this score is probably one of the best things they've ever made, I'm gonna be honest. It's just so cool. I don't know how else I can really word this. The soundtrack is just cool personified. And the fact that it is able to perfectly modernize the world of Tron, but still have it feel like Tron, is, again, very impressive. I haven't seen the original Tron, but I know from the moment this movie starts and the soundtrack just blares out, I instantly know I'm in the world of Tron again. And for the soundtrack to do that is very impressive. I mean, this soundtrack also goes perfectly hand in hand with just the incredibly bizarre and vibrant visuals that this movie has to offer. It's just a brilliant soundtrack that would work very well in a club at certain points, but there are also some really epic, grand moments that perfectly add to the sense of grandeur that this movie has to offer, especially when the main character, whose name I've already forgot, I mean, yeah, like I said, the characters are that memorable. When the main character goes into the world of Tron, the soundtrack really comes into its own and really embraces the electronic synth-driven side that you're kind of expecting. Because beforehand, it's very, you know, typical. It's an orchestra, you know, you got pianos, violins, all that. But as soon as he enters the world of Tron, you get that same orchestra, but mixed in with some heavy bass lines, some heavy synths, and a lot of electronic elements as well, which perfectly, I don't know, it just works so well, especially for following that main character's transition from the real world into the world of Tron. At number 4 is the soundtrack for Monsters by John Hopkins. Now, before I talk about this music for this movie, I probably have to explain what this movie is. for those of you that may not know. Monsters was released in 2010 and is the directorial debut of Gareth Edwards, the same guy that brought us Rogue One, A Star Wars Story, and 2014's Godzilla. Now, say what you will about those movies, I personally really like them, but I've always appreciated Gareth Edwards as a filmmaker, specifically because of this movie. He filmed it on a shoestring budget, and did all of the special effects himself on a small Mac laptop. And the fact that it looks as good as it does is, again, really impressive. And like I said, I've always had an admiration for him as a filmmaker since then. Even though his more recent films haven't been as good as Monsters, I still do appreciate anything he is able to create, because I think he is a very impressive filmmaker. But by far, my favourite aspect of Monsters is the soundtrack by John Hopkins. Now, for those of you that don't know who John Hopkins is, he's normally an electronic music producer who actually very rarely does film scores. He's only done 2, and this is one of them, and as you can tell, he blew it out of the water with this first one, because this is the first one he ever did. Just going off on a thing here, I'm a fan of his music outside of his film scores anyway. I mean, his albums Immunity and Singularity, I personally think are 2 of the best albums of the entire decade. Yeah, they're kind of an acquired taste, especially if you're not into ambient electronic music, but I think they're fucking brilliant albums, and this score brings out an entire other side to John Hopkins that you might not be used to, especially if you're used to his more electronic dance oriented stuff. And I mean, it really does show. Even though on a lot of his albums he's able to bring out some form of a quieter, more orchestral side, this soundtrack is where he fully comes into his own in that field, and it works so well. Even the main theme, which is called Candles, is really simple but incredibly effective. As far as I'm aware, it's only used a couple of times in the movie, but even just hearing that theme on its own works incredibly well. And even some of the other moments in the score, such as this track called Temple, which is used at a very quiet moment in the movie where the 2 main characters aren't really doing much, just adds this a grand scale to what is a very low-key film. And the fact that the score's able to do that is just brilliant. And he manages to add a lot of different elements to this movie. And I personally think if it wasn't for his score, the movie wouldn't be as effective as it was with conveying specific emotions. I mean, yes, it is very well shot, and the 2 main actors, Scoot McNairy and Whitney Able, are both brilliant in the movie. But personally, I think John Hopkins' score really does bring more out of this movie than it really has to offer. Because if you just had the movie on its own, it would be okay. But his score personally adds this entire new layer to it that just improves it in so many different ways and adds an entirely new and more emotionally complex layer to the whole thing that really does make it a worthwhile experience, whether you're watching the film or just listening to the soundtrack on its own. And number 3 is the soundtrack for Her by Canadian indie rock band Arcade Fire. Now, similar to the last one, I was a fan of Arcade Fire long before they did this soundtrack, and as far as I'm aware, this is the only full-on score they've done for a movie. They haven't really done anything else movie-related since then, or even before that. And yeah, I was a fan of this band years before they worked on this film. But that being said, this score that they did for Spike Jonze's film is one of the best things they've ever created. And that's saying something, considering Neon Bible is one of my favourite albums of all time. But yeah, what they added to this movie is just so charming and stripped back, yet incredibly beautiful at the same time. Because they did something that is actually kind of ingenious when you think about it. Considering that this film is essentially a romantic comedy with a bit of a sci-fi element to it, what they decided to do with the score, rather than going for like the stereotypical route, which would have been, synths, ambient sounds and all that, they instead strip it all the way back with pianos and some occasional, other more traditional instruments as well. And it works just as well as, say, synths and, an ambient soundtrack would. If anything, I think the piano works much better because, one, you can tell the piano is recorded, in a room with an actual piano, and two, there are actually some very minor mistakes in the piano playing. But when I say it feels intentional in the sense that it adds to the human nature of the main character in this film and adds some sense of unpredictability to the whole movie as well, along with it being kind of conveying this sense of natural beauty. There is natural beauty in the sense of the film, and there is natural beauty in the sense of the soundtrack as well. It's being recorded with traditional instruments, and the fact that there are a couple of mistakes, but not heavily noticeable mistakes, just adds to the authenticity of it all. And I think it really fits the movie as well. And if you haven't seen Her, which I know some of you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's an absolutely brilliant movie and is one of Spike Jonze's best. It's definitely one of Joaquin Phoenix's best performances as well. Okay, now we're into the big ones. And at number 2 is the score for Gone Girl by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. Now, I know most people would rather go with their score for The Social Network, and don't get me wrong, that is a really good soundtrack. But personally, the score for Gone Girl has hit me since I saw the movie. Whereas the score for The Social Network has taken me a while to appreciate, because when I first watched The Social Network, the soundtrack wasn't one of the things I took away from it. Whereas Gone Girl, one of the things I took away from it from first viewing alone was the soundtrack. Because it goes for this entirely different approach to The Social Networks. The Social Networks feels very jittery, glitchy, but also very clean in production as well, kind of adding to the tone of the film. The Gone Girl soundtrack feels, again, very glitchy, but also very horrible and nasty, and there are so many noises and sounds put into the mix here that just sound like they shouldn't be there. And I mean this all in a positive way. You probably think I'm shitting all over this soundtrack. I'm not. I mean all of what I'm saying in a positive way, because these odd sounds that you hear in the mix and the uneasy feeling that it gives you perfectly adds to the suspenseful nature of the movie. Because I personally think Gone Girl is one of David Fincher's best movies. I might be on my own there, but I do think Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross's score for this film, again, adds to that suspenseful, uneasy feeling you get when you watch this movie. And there's a few tracks in particular where the glitchy, weird, almost ambient style of music really comes into its own. There's one in particular, the name of the track I've forgotten, but the track in particular it uses everything from this looping bass line and very calm synths, along with very odd sampling choices of I presume something like a gate closing and a man coughing. Yeah, it's a very strange soundtrack that might not be for everyone, but if you've seen the movie, you will know that it fits with the slightly off-kilter tone that the movie is trying to set up. You are being shown a straightforward thriller to an extent, but you know that something is not quite right under the surface, and this score perfectly reflects that. And finally, my number one favourite score of all time is American Beauty by Thomas Newman. Now, again, like Michael Giacchino and John Williams, I knew I had to have a score by Thomas Newman on this soundtrack somewhere. And it was very hard to choose one of his, because this guy is responsible for the Shawshank Redemption soundtrack, and that score is brilliant. Like, I mean, if you've seen the movie, you know how impactful that score is, especially during some specific moments in the film. But in the end, I had to go with American Beauty, because this is one of those rare scores that works perfectly in context with the movie, but also just as well listening to it of its own regard as a soundtrack. I've listened to this soundtrack many times while revising for college or university work. There are some genuinely simplistic but beautiful moments in the score, specifically the track A Rose. That piece is just so lovely to listen to. And yeah, I genuinely don't know what else to say about this score other than the fact that the title sums it up perfectly. It is beautiful. The way he uses certain things like xylophones and the violin are just so simple, yet incredibly gorgeous when you hear them. And again, going back to the context of the movie, when you pair it with some of the iconic imagery from that film, it just works so well hand in hand. Thomas Newman is an incredible composer, and he's made some brilliant scores in his time. He's gone a bit downhill in recent years, but I personally think he peaked in the 90s with Shawshank Redemption and this. Out of all the soundtracks that I've listed in this video, I highly recommend you listen to the American Beauty soundtrack, or even just watch the movie. I mean, yes, it has Kevin Spacey in it, but pushing all the real life stuff aside, the movie itself is brilliant, and Kevin Spacey is brilliant in the film, and the score just adds this whole layer to it as well. And again, it's one of those scores where you kind of know it even if you haven't seen the movie. Like, if you were to hear the soundtrack outside of the film, just, you know, in an everyday scenario, you would just go, oh yeah, no, I've heard that before. I think it's even been remixed into like a club song as well back in the early 2000s. And it just goes to show how good it is, because it can kind of be taken, it's been taken and transferred to other mediums and works just as well in my opinion. But yes, American Beauty is my favourite score of all time, just because it's really bloody good. So guys, those were my 10 favourite movie scores of all time. I hope you enjoyed this video, and like I said at the start, I'd love to see what you guys think in the comments below. What are some of your favourite film scores of all time? I'd love to know down below. If you enjoyed the video, then give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Bye.